The tip of the blade, a sliver of moonlit steel, pressed cold against my throat. I didn't flinch. Not a muscle. The chill of it was a sharp counterpoint to the velvet collar of my evening cloak, the cloying scent of jasmine from the garden party below, and the frantic pounding of my own heart against my ribs. This was Melbourne, 1928, and even its most opulent rooftops held their shadows and their secrets. "Well, darling," I purred, my voice a low rumble, barely above the sighing night breeze. "Isn't this an intimate little chat?" A touch less formal than I usually prefer, but certainly memorable. The hand holding the dagger didn't waver. Strong. Masculine. But the sleeve of the dark coat gave nothing away. It was a man, naturally. Always a man when the stakes were this high and the moonlight so dramatic. He breathed a shallow, ragged breath against my hair, the scent of expensive cigar smoke and something faintly metallic, blood, reaching me. Below, the strains of a jazz band drifted up from the Fitzroy mansion, punctuated by the tinkling of champagne glasses and the delighted shrieks of bright young things. They were celebrating a triumph, a grand acquisition. Monsieur Dubois, the famed French art dealer, had arrived, bringing with him a collection of Impressionist masterpieces, supposedly long lost, now gracing Melbourne's shores. And I, Miss Phryne Fisher, had been invited to inspect them. My sharp eyes, accustomed to discerning fakes from genuine articles, had already spotted several unsettling details. A brushstroke too bold, a signature too precise, a canvas with a whisper of modernity that didn't quite fit. Dubois was a charmer, a flamboyant peacock with a silk scarf and a knowing smirk, but even his theatrics couldn't mask the faint, lingering scent of deceit. "You know too much, Miss Fisher," the voice hissed, a low rasp that scratched at the edges of the night. It wasn't a voice I recognized from the party, no society darling or boozy politician. This was a voice that belonged to the quiet corners, the whispered deals. "Knowing too much is rather my profession, dear boy," I countered, a small, confident smile playing on my lips, though my mind raced. How had he gotten up here without me hearing him? My senses were rarely so dull. My hand, hidden by the folds of my cloak, slowly, subtly, drifted towards the pearl-handled pistol nestled in my garter. A girl had to be prepared for impromptu rooftop rendezvous. "These paintings, they are not what they seem," I continued, pushing him, probing. "And neither, I suspect, are you." The blade pressed harder, a tiny bead of warm blood blossoming on my skin, a delicate crimson bloom against the pale canvas of my throat. A warning. And a promise. "You concern yourself with matters that do not belong to you," he growled. "Melbourne's art world is a delicate ecosystem. Some truths are best left undisturbed. And some lies are best exposed." I shot back, my patience, as delightful as it usually was, beginning to fray. I had a dinner engagement, and a blood-stained gown would simply not do. A sudden sharp clang from below, like a dropped tray, startled us both. The man's attention flickered for the barest fraction of a second. It was all I needed. My hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength, twisting it sharply. The dagger clattered against the terracotta tiles of the roof. Simultaneously, my other hand produced the pistol, the cold steel a reassuring weight. "Now, about those truths," I said, stepping back, the moonlight glinting off the barrel of my weapon. "I find them utterly irresistible." But as I aimed, the man, astonishingly fast, pivoted and vaulted over the low parapet of the roof, disappearing into the velvety blackness of the night. I rushed to the edge, peering down. A quick, agile descent using a drainpipe, then a silent shadow melting into the alley below. Gone. My heart still hammered, but a thrill, sharp and exhilarating, coursed through me. A missing postman was one thing, a deadly secret woven into the very fabric of Melbourne's glittering society, with a stolen art collection at its heart, was quite another. This was exactly the kind of exquisite trouble I adored. I retrieved the dagger. It was beautiful, antique Japanese, with a hilt of intricate, carved jade. A ceremonial piece, not a common thug's weapon. This wasn't a random mugging. This was a message. And it told me one thing with absolute clarity. I was already far deeper into this mystery than I'd anticipated. Monsieur Dubois's grand unveiling gala was tomorrow night, at the Orient Wharf. I had a feeling it was going to be an event. And I suspected the art dealer might not be quite as charming by the time I was through with him. Or, perhaps, by the time someone else was. This was a game of shadows and light, and I, Miss Phryne Fisher, intended to illuminate every dark corner. The serpent had given its kiss, and now it was my turn to dance. Chapter 1. The air at the Orient Wharf Gallery shimmered with anticipation and the heady scent of champagne. Crystal chandeliers, borrowed from the most exclusive ballrooms, dripped light onto polished marble floors, reflecting the hushed excitement of Melbourne's elite. Society swans, draped in shimmering silks and pearls, glided past me, their conversation a gentle murmur about Impressionist brushstrokes and astonishing provenance. Every man in the room, from the city's richest shipping magnates to its most influential politicians, wore an expectant, slightly covetous gleam in their eyes. Tonight, art was not just beauty. It was power, prestige, and a rather substantial investment. I, Miss Phryne Fisher, stood near a grand archway, a glass of Veuve Clicquot in hand, observing the scene with a practiced, cynical eye. My silver-beaded gown, a daring creation of French silk that shimmered with every subtle movement, drew its usual share of admiring glances and scandalized whispers. Let them talk. I preferred to make an entrance and an exit on my own terms. My companion for the evening, De Williams, my fiercely loyal and perpetually flustered companion, clutched her handbag tighter. "Oh, Miss Fisher, it's all so grand," she whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the dazzling spectacle. "But do you really think these paintings are real?" I gave a small, knowing smile. "That, my dear Dot, is the million-dollar question. Or rather the £500,000 question, given their supposed value." My gaze drifted across the room to a rather portly gentleman, Mr. Harrison, a known art collector with a penchant for flashy purchases, who was already engaged in a heated whisper with a younger, sharper-dressed man I recognized as Mr. Silas Vance, a rival dealer with a reputation for acquiring pieces through unconventional means. Money was clearly already changing hands, or promises of it. The object of everyone's adoration, Monsieur Antoine Dubois, finally made his grand appearance. He entered with the theatricality of a seasoned performer, a flash of scarlet silk handkerchief protruding from his breast pocket, his dark hair slicked back, a perfectly manicured hand gesturing expansively. He was all charm and audacious confidence, kissing the hands of prominent society ladies and sharing conspiratorial winks with potential buyers. He paused before the largest canvas, a supposed Monet, and addressed the eager crowd with a booming voice, thick with a charming French accent. "Mesdames et messieurs, welcome to a night of beauty, of history reclaimed. These masterpieces, hidden away for decades, now finally grace your eyes. Each brushstroke, a whisper from the past, a testament to genius." As he spoke, my attention was drawn not to the paintings themselves, but to the people around them. I noticed Mr. Fitzwilliam, a prominent banker and investor, standing stiffly, his face pale beneath his carefully trimmed mustache, his eyes darting nervously towards Dubois. Fitzwilliam was known to have invested heavily in Dubois's ventures. Was that a look of excitement, or of dread? Then there was Lady Beatrice Carrington, a formidable matriarch of Melbourne society, a connoisseur of fine art and even finer gossip. Her hawk-like gaze was fixed not on the Monet, but on the back of Dubois's head. There was a hard, almost predatory glint in her eyes. I had heard whispers that Lady Beatrice had been outbid by Dubois on a previous acquisition, and she was not a woman who took kindly to being thwarted. A movement near the corner of the gallery caught my eye. The gallery's curator, a mousy, almost invisible woman named Eleanor Finch, stood by a velvet rope, her shoulders hunched, her eyes downcast. She clutched a sheaf of papers, her knuckles white. She looked utterly miserable, a stark contrast to the glittering opulence surrounding her. Her own gallery, her own prestige, rested heavily on the authenticity of these pieces. If they were fakes, her career would be ruined. But even more than that, there was a raw, wounded look in her eyes that spoke of a deeper, more personal pain. I excused myself from telling her I was going to retrieve another glass of champagne, but my real intention was to get closer to the paintings, to examine them with my own eyes, to see if my earlier suspicions held firm. As I moved through the throng, I felt a familiar prickle at the back of my neck. Someone was watching me. Not admiringly, but with an intensity that spoke of suspicion, perhaps even malice. I glanced over my shoulder, catching the fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure melting into the deeper alcove near the staff entrance. A man. Tall, lean, with a flash of dark hair. My rooftop assailant? Or merely a nervous waiter? My senses, however, told me it was the former. He was here, perhaps to observe me, or perhaps to ensure his plan, whatever it was, went off without a hitch. I reached the Monet, feigning casual interest, but my eyes were dissecting every detail. The texture of the paint, the way the light caught the canvas, the very signature itself. My initial instinct was confirmed. The brushstrokes, though skillfully applied, lacked the fluid, almost spontaneous quality of a true Monet. The colors, while vibrant, were a shade too crisp, too modern. These were undoubtedly forgeries. Clever, magnificent forgeries, perhaps, but forgeries nonetheless. Du Bois was a con man. And a very successful one, if the eager faces of the investors around me were any indication. But cons always unravel. And when they did, they rarely did so quietly. Just then, a piercing shriek cut through the opulent hum of the gallery. It was Dot. My head snapped up. She was pointing, her face ashen, towards the dais where Du Bois had been moments ago. The crowd collectively gasped. There, sprawled on the polished marble floor, amidst the scattered champagne flutes and the fallen velvet ropes, was Monsieur Antoine Du Bois. His flamboyant scarlet handkerchief was now a dark, sticky mess. A ceremonial Japanese dagger, its jade hilt gleaming ominously, was plunged deep into his chest. The murmurs of the crowd died, replaced by a stunned, horrifying silence. A single drop of blood, black against the pristine marble, slowly spread, mimicking the abstract patterns of a modern painting. The serpent had indeed given its kiss. And this time it was fatal. My eyes scanned the stunned faces. Mr. Harrison, the collector, looked bewildered. Lady Beatrice's grim expression seemed almost triumphant. Mr. Fitzwilliam had sagged against a wall, his face utterly devoid of color. And Eleanor Finch, the curator, had let out a choked cry, dropping her papers, her hand flying to her mouth. The shadowy figure I'd seen earlier was gone. Melted away like mist in the face of the terrible reality. A detective's work always began when the polite facade of society cracked. And this one had just shattered into a million glittering, bloody pieces. The game had truly begun. Chapter 2. The immediate aftermath of the murder was a thrilling chaos. The crowd, momentarily frozen by the shock, erupted into a cacophony of panicked screams and agitated demands. Champagne glasses shattered. A stout gentleman slipped on the marble, scattering pearls. It was anarchy dressed in evening wear. But for me, Miss Phryne Fisher, this was where clarity reigned. While the rest of the wharf dissolved into hysteria, my mind sharpened, processing the scene with the cold precision of a diamond cutter. I knelt beside Monsieur Du Bois's body, ignoring the frantic pleas of a nervous police constable who had somehow materialized from the throng. "Don't touch anything, Miss Fisher," he stammered, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. "Nonsense, constable," I replied without looking up. "Observation is useless without proximity. And do try to control the human spill. You're ruining the evidence." The ceremonial Japanese dagger was still lodged in Du Bois's chest, its jade hilt a shocking contrast to the dark cloth. I noted the angle of the stab, a sharp, downward thrust, delivered with surprising strength. The killer was not an amateur. But the most telling detail wasn't the dagger itself, it was what was not there. Du Bois, ever the showman, always wore an exquisite platinum watch, a gift he claimed from a Russian prince. It was missing. And more importantly, the leather portfolio he clutched everywhere, containing the supposed certificates of provenance for the Impressionist paintings, was gone. The motive, Hastings, I murmured to myself, recalling my old friend Poirot's methods, is not about passion. It is about paper. I looked up at Detective Inspector Jack Robinson, who arrived on the scene with his usual air of weary competence, his dark suit a stark anchor in the shimmering chaos. He surveyed the room, his gaze resting briefly on me, a silent acknowledgement that I was already halfway through the investigation. "Phryne," he greeted me, his tone clipped. "I assume you have already touched the body and rearranged the clues?" "I have merely illuminated them, Jack. For your benefit, naturally. The motive is the missing portfolio and the platinum watch. But the murder weapon is the key to the killer's identity. This dagger is a Gen G style, antique, not French, not Australian. Someone planned this, and they brought their own exotic props." Robinson sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Everyone in this room is a potential suspect, Phryne. They've all been duped. I had 5 separate tips earlier this week claiming these paintings were forgeries." "Precisely," I agreed, rising to my feet, my gown thankfully unstained. "The killer isn't someone motivated by passion, but by the fear of exposure and financial ruin. Dubois's death stops the investigation, preserves the con, and ensures his clients remain silent, either out of shame or out of desperation to sell the forgeries before the truth gets out." I scanned the faces of the nearest suspects, all now corralled by the police. Mr. Fitzwilliam, the banker, he still looked ill. A heavy investor, he stood to lose millions and, more damagingly, his reputation as a shrewd businessman. Financial disaster breeds desperation. Lady Beatrice Carrington, the collector, cold, composed, and now glaring at the constable guarding the Monet. She had motive in vengeance and a vast network that could procure an exotic weapon. Mr. Silas Vance, the rival dealer, smirking slightly, as if Dubois's demise was merely an amusing inconvenience. He stood to gain most directly, now having a clear run at the city's wealthy clientele. But his motivation felt too professional, too clean for such a messy, dramatic murder. But it was the quiet despair of the gallery's curator, Eleanor Finch, that truly piqued my interest. While others were loud, she was silent. While others panicked, she seemed to shrink. I walked over to her. "Miss Finch," I said gently. "You dropped your papers earlier. May I assist you?" She looked up, her eyes swimming with tears, yet holding a surprising flash of intelligence. I was going to call the police myself, Miss Fisher. Before this happened." "And why is that?" Her voice was a strained whisper. "Because the paintings. I knew they were fakes. Dubois brought in the collection and insisted on hanging them himself, not allowing my staff near them. But I spent all yesterday examining the microscopic images of the canvases. They are brilliant, but they are not Monet or Renoir. They are the work of a modern master copyist. And your reputation rests on the veracity of this gallery," I observed. "It is more than my reputation," she whispered, clutching a fragile, water-stained document she had retrieved. "It is the gallery's funding. Mr. Fitzwilliam promised a massive endowment based on the success of this viewing. If these were exposed as forgeries, I would not only be ruined, but the entire gallery would close. Dubois threatened me when I tried to stop the showing. He said I would be silenced. A flicker of a red herring, perhaps. She had the greatest immediate motive for silence, but did she have the nerve to stab a man in a room full of people? I examined the document she held. It wasn't a gallery report. It was a letter of resignation. Dated today. "Why resign?" I asked. "Because I couldn't bear to be associated with the lie," she said, her voice cracking. "I was going to hand this to Dubois tonight, then go to the press with the truth tomorrow." Eleanor Finch had planned to expose the fraud, not silence it. That lessened her motive for murder, unless she was pushed past her breaking point. As the police began to move the body, a junior constable approached me, holding something wrapped in a silk handkerchief. "Miss Fisher, we found this tucked behind the large Monet canvas. It's unusual." He unwrapped it. It was a small, heavy wooden frame. Inside, not a painting, but a crisp, yellowed photograph of two young men in army uniform, standing stiffly together. It was a photograph that had no business being at an Impressionist gallery. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, were two names, A.D. and L.V. I felt a sudden, electric surge of understanding. Du Bois wasn't just a simple con man. He was tied to something deeper, something historical and personal. The missing art was merely the brightly colored lure for a decades-old act of betrayal. "Jack," I called to Robinson, holding up the photograph. "Our serpent's trail does not lead to Paris. It leads to the trenches of the Great War." Robinson looked at the photograph, then at the jade dagger, then back at the body of the flamboyant Frenchman. His expression hardened. "So the murder is not about art, but about history and revenge? And who, Phryne, is A.D. and L.V.? "One of them," I said, tucking the photograph carefully into my beaded evening bag, "was Du Bois. And the other? I suspect the other is someone still standing in this room, someone who served with Du Bois and was betrayed by him long ago." I swept my gaze across the suspects, feeling the delicious chill of a new hunt. My eye stopped at Fitzwilliam, the banker, who was now being helped to a chair by one of the constables. As he sank down, his hand brushed against his coat pocket, and I caught the fleeting, unmistakable glint of a platinum watch chain. The same type of watch that was missing from Du Bois's wrist. "Jack," I whispered, "Mr. Fitzwilliam is looking very unwell. I think it's time to ask him where he got his watch." Fitzwilliam, catching my gaze, stiffened, his face going from pale to a ghastly translucent grey. The tension in the gallery, which had been about the body, now pivoted, sharp and menacing, toward the wealthy, seemingly respectable banker. This quiet, proper man, who had staked his fortune on the forgeries, held a piece of Du Bois's personal history, and perhaps the smoking gun. Was he L.V.? The serpent was cornered, and the next move would be deadly. Chapter 3. The moment my gaze locked onto Mr. Fitzwilliam's terrified, ashen face, the polite restraint of the Orient Wharf gallery dissolved entirely. The tension, which moments before had been a low hum of collective horror, now became a suffocating pressure focused entirely on the disgraced banker. He was slumped in the velvet armchair, his impeccably tailored evening jacket rumpled, his hand instinctively clamping over his waistcoat pocket where I had seen the platinum chain glint. "Mr. Fitzwilliam," I said, my voice cutting through the strained silence like a razor through silk. I didn't raise my voice. I simply allowed my tone to carry the weight of certainty. "A platinum watch is rather a distinctive timepiece. Did Monsieur Du Bois offer it to you as a gift, perhaps? A token of gratitude for your generous investment in his rather inventive collection?" Detective Inspector Robinson, catching the urgency in my eyes, stepped forward, his expression severe. The constables immediately shifted their positions, blocking the exits and zeroing in on the banker. "Mr. Fitzwilliam," Robinson stated, his authority undeniable, "Miss Fisher has observed something of interest. We require you to surrender the watch you are currently carrying." Fitzwilliam, a man whose entire life had been defined by order, decorum, and the unshakable faith of his clientele, seemed to shatter. His carefully constructed mask of respectability cracked, revealing a frantic, desperate man beneath. "This is an outrage," he sputtered, his voice cracking. "I am a substantial taxpayer and a founder of this very gallery. This watch is a private possession, a family heirloom. Heirlooms are rarely transferred from one wrist to another moments before a stabbing," I interjected smoothly, taking a step closer. "Unless, of course, that watch was a promise. A keepsake between two men who served together in the darkest hours of the Great War, a promise that was violently betrayed." I held up the faded photograph I had found. "Do you recognize your friend, Mr. Fitzwilliam? The man marked A.D. I believe he now answers to the name Antoine Du Bois." The mention of the name A.D. Arthur Davies, I now surmised, using a simple anagram to link him to the respectable banker L.V., Louis Vance, perhaps, or Lancelot Vernon, caused Fitzwilliam to gasp, clutching his chest. His resistance evaporated, replaced by a terrible, crushing defeat. He slowly, trembling, reached into his pocket and placed the platinum watch on the table. It was heavy, engraved on the back with the initials AD. He stole it, Fitzwilliam choked out, the admission thick with decades of festering bitterness. He stole more than the watch. He stole my life. The smoky backroom of the Orient Wharf gallery suddenly felt far away, replaced by the mud and terror of the trenches. Fitzwilliam, cornered, began to confess a tale of wartime betrayal. He and Arthur Davies, now Du Bois, had been close friends, bunkered together in France. Davies had been given the watch by a dying comrade. One night, Fitzwilliam entrusted Davies with his life savings, money meant for a post-war life with his fiancée, to carry home during a brief leave. Davies never returned. He deserted, taking the money, and leaving Fitzwilliam to face a court-martial for desertion, from which he barely escaped with his honor intact. He vanished, Fitzwilliam whispered, tears streaming down his face. I lost my fiancée, my savings, and nearly my reputation. I spent 20 years rebuilding my life, only for him to swagger back here as Du Bois, flaunting my stolen fortune and his fake French accent. The plot thickened, folding back on itself. Du Bois wasn't just a con man duping the public with forgeries. He was a traitor who had stolen an identity and a future. When you discovered the paintings were fakes, I pressed, and that Du Bois was Davies, your betrayer. What did you do last night, Mr. Fitzwilliam? He shook his head vehemently. I didn't kill him. I went to his suite at the Grand Hotel last night. I showed him the old photograph. I demanded my money back, demanded he leave Melbourne before I exposed him for the deserter he was. He just laughed. Said I was still the same fool. But I didn't stab him. I only took the watch, a small piece of what he owed me, while he was distracted answering a telephone call. It was pitiful, I know, but I needed something back. His story held the unmistakable ring of emotional truth. Fitzwilliam, ruined by a cowardice he wasn't responsible for, had motive for murder, yes, but he also had a powerful, believable alibi for the watch's removal before the murder. Furthermore, the jade dagger was not the weapon of a panicked banker exacting revenge. It was the weapon of someone making a dark, dramatic statement. So, not the banker driven by financial ruin, I mused, turning to Robinson. But a man driven by historical betrayal. A fine red herring, Jack, but I suspect our killer is still among us, and their motive is closer to the art itself. The focus now shifted back to the forgery. Du Bois's con was about more than money. It was about the forgeries themselves. Who had the knowledge, the skill, and the access to forge Impressionist masters to such a high degree? And, crucially, who would care enough about the integrity of the art to kill the dealer? I remembered Eleanor Finch, the curator, and her quiet desperation. Her impending resignation and her knowledge of the fakes made her a solid suspect, but she lacked the physical presence for the sharp, forceful stab. My eyes fell upon a younger man, introduced earlier as Monsieur Du Bois's discreet financial assistant, Mr. Leo Vance, perhaps the LV from the photo. He was being questioned by a junior constable, his answers precise, his demeanor unervingly calm. I intercepted Robinson. Jack, direct your men to discreetly check the backgrounds of every name linked to this forgery. The buyers, the sellers, and especially the artists. I want to know who is proficient enough to create masterpieces, and who had access to Du Bois's inner circle. I strode over to Mr. Vance. He was elegantly dressed, with piercing, intelligent eyes and a meticulous hairstyle. Mr. Vance, I smiled, my most charming, disarming smile. A terrible tragedy. You must be distraught, losing your employer. He returned my smile, a faint, cold curve of his lips. I am disciplined, Miss Fisher. Distraught is for the amateurs. I was merely his bookkeeper, managing the logistics of the sale. I am, you see, quite detached from the emotional art of it all. Detached, perhaps, but not unknowing. Tell me, Mr. Vance, was Du Bois the artist behind these splendid forgeries, or merely the financier? Vance's eyes flickered, just for a moment, an acknowledgement of my accurate deduction. Du Bois, or rather Davies, had no artistic talent. He acquired the pieces from a single source. An astonishingly gifted, but tragically uncredited, artist who worked primarily in Europe. And this artist? Who were they? I have no idea, Vance said smoothly. All transactions were anonymous, facilitated by a series of numbered accounts. Du Bois was meticulous about protecting his supplier. After all, a genius forger is a rare commodity. I didn't believe him for a second. Vance's composure was too perfect. His detachment was a practiced art. He was guarding the single most important secret in this whole affair, the identity of the artist. Why? Because the artist would have the ultimate motive, not money, but the furious, wounded pride of seeing their genius used for a cheap swindle. As I studied Vance, I noticed something subtle. A faint, almost imperceptible smudge of oil paint on the cuff of his otherwise immaculate shirt, a color that looked suspiciously like the cerulean blue dominating the large Monet forgery. "Mr. Vance," I said, leaning in, my voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "You claimed detachment, yet your cuff seems to be wearing a small piece of the Monet. A bookkeeper, carrying the ghost of a brushstroke? That strikes me as a peculiar occupational hazard." Vance's composure finally broke. His nostrils flared, and the cold mask of detachment dissolved into a flash of raw, desperate fear. He knew I was on to the truth. He was going to expose her. Vance hissed, his voice trembling with a passionate intensity that belied his previous coldness. Davies promised her fame, a glorious unveiling. Not some cheap, anonymous swindle. He promised her dignity. Her. I pressed. "The forger is a woman?" But before he could utter another word, a commotion erupted at the rear of the gallery. A sudden violent scuffle near the staff corridor. Robinson's voice bellowed. "Stop him. He's getting away." My head snapped around. Leo Vance, using the distraction to his advantage, had shoved a constable and was sprinting toward the service door that led into the maze of hidden alleyways of the Orient Wharf. "He's not escaping my questions that easily," I declared, tossing my now empty champagne flute onto a velvet tray. Ignoring Robinson's shout to stay back, I hitched up my silver gown and, with a grace that few women in the 1920s could manage, sprinted after him, my sensible heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Vance was fast, but Phryne Fisher was fearless and determined. The answer lay in his flight and in the identity of the female genius forger he was desperately trying to protect. The service door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into the humid, fish-smelling darkness of the wharf. The chase was on, and the true identity of the serpent, the anonymous mastermind behind the art, was just a sprint away. Who was she? And was she the ultimate killer? Chapter 4. The chase led me from the glittering spectacle of the Orient Wharf gallery into the raw, industrial heart of the docks, a maze of dripping pipes, stacked crates, and the heavy, brine-laced air of the ocean. Leo Vance was a blur of expensive wool, surprisingly agile as he leaped over discarded rope and slippery cobblestones. My heels, while fashionable, were not built for a nocturnal steeplechase, but adrenaline and the scent of a fresh, shocking revelation lent wings to my feet. "Mr. Vance. Stop," I called out, my voice echoing off the corrugated iron sheds. "The identity of the artist won't stay hidden forever, and running only confirms your complicity." He never once looked back, but his desperate flight confirmed my suspicion. He was protecting the forger. But why such passionate loyalty to an anonymous artist who had allowed her genius to be used for a cheap con? I finally cornered him behind a stack of tarpaulin-covered barrels, drawing my pearl-handled pistol and leveling it at his chest. The click of the hammer seemed deafening in the sudden stillness. "This is hardly polite, Miss Fisher," Vance panted, his hands raised in surrender, his suit now streaked with dirt and fear. "Politeness is often overrated, Mr. Vance. Now, tell me who she is. The female genius who painted those magnificent fakes. And be quick, before Inspector Robinson and his constables arrive to ask their own, less sympathetic questions." Vance's breath hitched. He glanced nervously at the dark shadows of the wharf. She is everything Davies, Du Bois, was not. She is an artist of truth, Miss Fisher. Her name is Juliet. Juliet Davies. My mind raced. Davies. The same surname as the deserter, Arthur Davies. His wife. His sister. His daughter, Vance whispered, the word carrying a note of profound, tragic reverence. Born in Paris, raised in obscurity. She inherited the talent of a god but was cursed with the legacy of a thief. Davies promised her that if she recreated the lost Impressionist collection, he would use the money to finally clear his name, to establish a legitimate gallery for her own work. A fine promise from a man who deserted his country and stole from his friend, I scoffed. But she believed him. She poured her soul, her genius, into those canvases. They are technically better than the originals, Miss Fisher. She gave the world beauty, and he rewarded her by keeping her anonymous and planning to abscond with the profits of the forgery, leaving her with nothing but the brush and the lie. Vance's explanation was a powerful counter-motive. Juliet Davies, the betrayed genius, had the most potent motive of all. Furious, wounded artistic pride and the need to protect her identity. And where is Miss Davies now? I demanded. Safe. I brought her back to Melbourne last week. She was devastated when she realized the exhibition was a vulgar sales pitch and that her father was still the same scoundrel. She demanded he expose the fakes himself, or she would. She wasn't seeking money, she was seeking justice for the art. And when did she last see her father, Mr. Vance? He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze steady, devoid of panic. Last night, Miss Fisher. She confronted him in his hotel room. She threatened him, demanding the certificates of provenance so she could burn them all. But she never touched him. She has an alibi I can prove. And what is that? She was with me, Miss Fisher. All night. We were in her studio, packing up the true evidence. Her early sketches, her materials. She was hysterical, consumed by the betrayal, but she never left my sight. Her hands, Miss Fisher, are only stained with paint, not with blood. His passionate defense of the girl felt genuine. But the murder had to be connected to the forgery and its exposure. If not the betrayed banker Fitzwilliam, and not the distraught curator Finch, and not the betrayed daughter Juliet, then who was left? Who had the motive to stop the exposure and the means to possess an exotic jade dagger? Suddenly, the flashing light of Robinson's torch cut through the gloom. He and two constables had caught up, their heavy boots thudding on the cobblestones. Phryne, what in heaven's name are you doing? Robinson demanded, seeing me, still glamorous in my evening wear, holding a gun on the grimy financial assistant. I lowered the pistol. Just concluding a rather fruitful interrogation, Jack. Mr. Vance has revealed that the forger is the deceased's own daughter, Miss Juliet Davies. She had the greatest motive to stop the con, but Mr. Vance provides a reliable alibi. Robinson was skeptical. An alibi from a man who just ran from the police? Hardly reliable, Phryne. Perhaps. But the identity of the true serpent lies in a combination of the old betrayal and the new art. The jade dagger, Jack, where does it come from? We're working on it. It's a very high-quality piece. Looks like a Japanese kaiken dagger, ceremonial. Likely picked up by someone who traveled extensively in the East. My mind jumped back to Lady Beatrice Carrington, the society doyenne who had glared at Du Bois with such palpable hostility. She was a renowned collector of Asian artifacts and had traveled the globe extensively. She had the motive of vengeance for being thwarted by Du Bois, and the means, the exotic weapon. We returned to the gallery just as the constables were packing up the last pieces of evidence. Lady Beatrice was still there, now talking imperiously to a junior officer, demanding to know when she could retrieve her coat and chauffeur. I moved closer to Robinson. Lady Beatrice is our next stop, Jack. I want to know where she was exactly at the moment of the stabbing, and if she has any Asian artifacts missing from her personal collection. Just as I finished the sentence, An elderly, stooped man in a frayed velvet jacket, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, rose and approached the velvet rope surrounding the Monet forgery. He didn't look like a collector or a guest. He looked like a man who spent his life in quiet contemplation. He peered closely at the canvas, his hands clasped behind his back. He spoke, his voice surprisingly firm and carrying a slight, artistic lilt. A magnificent fraud, gentlemen. Truly magnificent. The master copyist has surpassed the original. But the dagger. He paused, his sharp eyes flicking to the chalk outline where Du Bois's body had lain. The dagger is not a kaiken. It is an antique yukao dagger, Chinese, ceremonial, from the Ming dynasty. Highly prized by scholars, but deadly sharp. It is also quite unique, Miss Fisher, because I recognize it. I felt a thrill of discovery. And where, sir, have you seen this unique Chinese dagger? The old man straightened, drawing himself up to his full, considerable height. It belongs to the private collection of Asian antiquities owned by the curator of this gallery. I am Professor Alastair Thorne, an advisor to the board. And I gifted that very dagger to Miss Eleanor Finch 10 years ago. Eleanor Finch. The mousy curator who had looked so miserable. She had the motive of reputational ruin, the knowledge of the fakes, and now, the indisputable murder weapon. The art, the betrayal, and the murder converged on the gallery's most overlooked employee. The mousy, broken woman had not been driven by money or old war grudges, but by the utter crushing destruction of her professional honor. She had the means, the motive, and a powerful secret. Where was Eleanor Finch now? I scanned the room, but she was nowhere to be seen. The final twist had arrived, placing the dagger not in the hand of a society enemy or an old war comrade, but in the hands of the seemingly invisible guardian of the art itself. Chapter 5. The air in the gallery, already thick with the scent of fear and stale champagne, became electrified by Professor Thorne's calm, devastating revelation. The dagger that killed Du Bois was not an exotic import brought by a glamorous traveler, but a specific recognizable artifact belonging to the most unlikely suspect, Eleanor Finch, the gallery's quiet, mousy curator. Inspector Robinson, momentarily stunned by this professional confirmation, barked orders. Find Miss Finch. Seal the building. No one leaves the wharf. A sensible approach, Jack, but a little late, I observed, pulling on my silver fox fur stole. Miss Finch wasn't among the hysterical crowd. She had the foresight to vanish the moment the murder created its necessary distraction. She didn't panic. She executed the plan. Why, Phryne? Robinson pressed, his eyes full of frustrated urgency. Fitzwilliam had the strongest motive for revenge and financial ruin. Why the curator? Because, Jack, the crime was never about the money, nor was it truly about revenge. It was a crime of conscience. Fitzwilliam's betrayal was ancient history. Eleanor Finch's betrayal was happening now, in her gallery, on her watch. Her professional life was built on the integrity of art. When Du Bois forced her to display those magnificent fakes, when he made her complicit in the desecration of her life's work, he destroyed her reputation and her soul. I turned to Professor Thorne, the art historian whose sharp eye had identified the weapon. Professor, that yukao dagger you gifted Miss Finch, was it merely a decorative piece? Oh, heavens no, Thorne said, shaking his head sadly. It was historically a weapon of ritual suicide, used by disgraced officials in the Ming court to restore honor. A gesture, Miss Fisher, of absolute, devastating integrity. The implication was chilling. Eleanor Finch hadn't just used a murder weapon, she had used a symbol of honor redeemed through blood. Her motive wasn't merely to stop the con, but to destroy the corruption that threatened to engulf her. She wouldn't have gone far, I declared, my eyes scanning the layout of the gallery. She's not a seasoned criminal, she's a desperate academic. She'll be hiding in the place that offers her the greatest solace or the final act of defiance. The director's office? Robinson suggested. Too obvious. She'll be where the art is. I led Robinson and a handful of constables away from the main hall, ignoring the bewildered, detained society guests. We found the staff entrance unlocked and slipped into the labyrinthine storage rooms and conservation studios located behind the main exhibition. The studios were a contrast to the glittering gallery. Dusty, smelling of varnish and turpentine, lit by single, bare bulbs. We found her in the restoration studio, a small room filled with easels, paint-splattered cloths, and the tools of her meticulous trade. Eleanor Finch stood before the massive Monet forgery, her back to us. She was no longer mousy or meek. Her posture was rigid, almost statuesque. In her hand, she held a large, silver palette knife, its point glinting in the weak light. Beside her, on a small wooden stool, rested the heavy jade yucao dagger. She had retrieved it after the murder. "Miss Finch," Robinson warned gently. "Put the knife down. It's over." She didn't turn. Her eyes, red and swollen, were fixed on the counterfeit canvas. "It's not over, Inspector. It's just beginning. He brought a lie into my house of truth. He tried to poison the very air we breathe here." I stepped forward, putting myself between the constables and the distressed woman. I spoke softly, with a tone of respect she hadn't received all evening. "The forgeries were brilliant, Miss Finch. Juliet Davies is a genius. A woman of her talent deserved better than to be hidden behind her father's pathetic charade. You knew that, didn't you?" A tear rolled down her cheek. "I saw her brushstrokes, Miss Fisher. They were sublime. She was painting masterpieces, and he was using them for a swindle. The irony, the sheer betrayal of the art, was unbearable. I asked him to stop. I threatened to resign and expose the whole thing. He just laughed. He said I was a foolish, irrelevant woman whose opinion meant nothing against his millions." That final dismissal, the crushing insult to her professionalism and gender, was the final key. It wasn't just the betrayal of the art, it was the dismissal of her honor by the arrogant, thieving Frenchman. "You knew he had the ceremonial dagger?" I asked. "No. I gave him the dagger yesterday. I keep my Asian collection here for security." He found it, admired it, and being the thief he was, tucked it into his pocket, saying he'd return it. I saw him with it tonight, wearing it as a piece of exotic theater. After I saw him die, I didn't think. I just grabbed it from the floor. I couldn't bear the thought of his blood on my beautiful gift. "Miss Finch," I countered gently, gesturing to the knife in her hand. "You did not stab him to retrieve your dagger. You stabbed him to retrieve your integrity. But you didn't just stab him once." She stiffened, her gaze finally meeting mine. There was no denial, only immense weariness. "The police autopsy will show that Antoine Dubois received 2 stab wounds," I explained, leaning closer. "The first, the deep one, with the ceremonial dagger, was the mortal wound. A dramatic statement. But you said you were nowhere near him when he was stabbed." Eleanor Finch's face crumpled. "I wasn't. I swear. I was by the velvet rope when Dot screamed. I dropped my papers, I heard the gasp, I saw him fall, already stabbed." A sudden sharp memory flashed through my mind. Fitzwilliam's platinum watch being taken before the murder. Leo Vance's desperate flight to protect Juliet Davies. And the curator's desperate need for honor. The story is incomplete, Miss Finch. Someone else was trying to silence Dubois at that same moment. Someone with a deeper, more immediate fear of exposure, I said, my gaze sweeping past the woman and settling on the large, covered easel in the corner. "It wasn't me, Miss Fisher. I was heartbroken, but I didn't kill him." "But I know who did," Eleanor whispered, her hand trembling. "It was Millie." Robinson and the constables exchanged confused glances. "Millie? Who is Millie?" Eleanor turned and pointed the palette knife at a stack of freshly primed canvases. "Millie is the true artist. Juliet Davies is a lie. Millie is the brilliant forger. Juliet Davies is her pseudonym, a fantasy name she used to paint masterpieces. But the man who revealed her secret, the man who was Dubois's accomplice, was the man who was running away tonight." The pieces slammed together with electrifying speed. Leo Vance, the man who had just run from me, the man with the paint on his cuff, the man who provided the alibi, was protecting the artist because he was her partner, her accomplice, perhaps her lover. Leo Vance gave Juliet Davies a convincing alibi, but he was protecting Millie, the real artist, I realized aloud. But why did he run, and why did she kill? Eleanor Finch pointed the palette knife toward the Monet forgery. Millie's art was perfect, Miss Fisher. But her conscience wasn't. She told Leo she couldn't stand the lie. She planned to expose her own work. She was going to tell the world the paintings were hers, not Monet's, destroying the con and her own career in one stroke. Du Bois found out. He tried to stop her. He found her here tonight, before the gala, attempting to slash the canvas to expose the fraud before the official viewing. And that's when he was stabbed. No, Eleanor shook her head, tears falling. That's when Leo Vance stepped in. Leo loved Millie. He couldn't let her ruin her genius. He couldn't let her kill the art. He plunged the dagger into Du Bois to stop him from destroying the canvas and to silence him before he could expose Millie's true identity, which would have landed her in prison. But Miss Finch, I countered, looking at the dagger. The professor said you owned this dagger. Yes. But Leo Vance is my nephew. He lived with me until he started working for Du Bois. He had access to my collection, and the keys to this studio. When I went home to write my resignation, he was here, helping Millie prepare for the exhibition. He used the ceremonial dagger, my dagger, to protect the woman he loved. The true murder motive was not revenge or reputation, but passionate protection of artistic genius. Leo Vance, the meticulous accountant, had killed to save the art and the artist. I looked at Eleanor Finch. She had not been the killer. She had been the second victim of the betrayal, her honor crushed. And the second stab wound, Miss Finch? I asked. The police will find too. Eleanor raised the silver palette knife in her hand, the blade glinting. When I found Leo running away, and then saw Du Bois on the floor, I saw the dagger. I saw the symbol of honor. I thought I needed to ensure the corruption was truly dead. I couldn't bear the thought of him living, even with a single wound. So I took the knife. And I drove it into his heart a second time. Not for revenge, Miss Fisher, but to ensure the lie could never breathe again. I lowered my pistol, a wave of profound sadness washing over me. The glamorous veneer of the Roaring Twenties had once again been torn away, revealing the raw, complex desperation of the human heart. Robinson sighed, the weight of the night settling on him. We have the killer, Phryne. And we have an accomplice. Not quite, Jack, I said, a slow, determined smile returning to my lips. Leo Vance killed the con man to protect the artist. But Eleanor Finch killed the idea of corruption to protect her honor. We have 2 knives, 2 wounds, and 2 desperate souls. The resolution was messy, complicated, and entirely human. I looked at the magnificent, fraudulent Monet, now stained with the moral wreckage of 2 lives. The champagne had stopped flowing, the society swans had fled, but the truth, though bloody, had finally been delivered to the Orient Wharf. I think, Inspector, I concluded, turning away from the tragic tableau, I've earned a very stiff drink. And I believe I know a smoky speakeasy where the price of honesty is less dear. Epilogue. A toast to the unsaid. The sun was a pale, exhausted smear above the docks as I finally left the Orient Wharf, leaving Inspector Robinson and his weary men to sort through the twin confessions of desperate loyalty and devastated honor. The elegance of the night was gone, replaced by the grim reality of dawn. I found my favorite speakeasy, the Crimson Poppy, still humming with defiant jazz and the comforting haze of expensive cigarette smoke. Slipping into a secluded velvet booth, I allowed a waiter to pour me a very large gin Ricky. The true tragedy of the Orient Wharf wasn't the death of the thief, Antoine Du Bois, but the ruin of 2 honest people. Eleanor Finch, whose profound respect for art drove her to a final, desperate act of violence, and Leo Vance, who threw away his freedom to protect the genius of the woman he loved. The art world, like life itself, is rarely as beautiful as it appears on the surface. It's always stained by betrayal, ambition, and the exquisite agony of secrets. I raised my glass to the fading night. To the brilliance of Millie Davies, the genius forger whose talent deserved a better debut. To Eleanor Finch, the woman who defended the integrity of her profession with the ritual of a ceremonial dagger. And to the beautiful, compelling lies that always hide the most devastating truths. Continue the adventure. Did you guess the true motive behind the Yukow dagger? Were you drawn in by the financial threat to Mr. Fitzwilliam? Or did the quiet desperation of Eleanor Finch hint at a deeper, more emotional crime? The secrets of the 1920s are endless, and Miss Phryne Fisher's case files are full of forgotten whispers and unsolved mysteries. If the blend of glamour, intrigue, and sharp-witted justice has captured your imagination, you're exactly where you need to be. Join the most exclusive club of mystery lovers. Subscribe to Mysteries and Roses now. We specialize in unearthing compelling crimes hidden beneath beautiful facades, just like this one. Click the notification bell so you never miss a new case, a new twist, or a new chance to solve the perfect crime before the final reveal. Until our next adventure, remember, always look closer than the surface, darling. The most beautiful roses often hide the sharpest thorns.